Let me say a few kind words. Okay. I'll take off the mask even. Hi everybody, good evening. Hello, Shane and Green's class and everybody else who could come. I'm Dan Soslak, the director of CLACS, and we're really pleased that we're able to sponsor this event this evening, which Professors Green and Gould instigated, and then Aaron sitting right behind, and Sonia and the rest of the CLACS staff helped put together. So tonight it is our very good fortune to be hosting Dr. John Horne Carter. John is an associate professor of anthropology at Appalachian State University. And we're here first and foremost to celebrate the debut of his brand new book, Gothic Sovereignty. Maybe you could hold up and wave a copy around. Gothic Sovereignty, Gangs and Statecraft in Honduras, which came out just in February, I think about a month ago. So John earned his bachelor's degree at Appalachian State, then went off to Columbia to earn an MA and a PhD, circled back around and has been teaching in the Department of Anthropology there. His areas of expertise include politics and affects, sovereignty and law, psychoanalysis and history, borders and immigration, incarceration and surveillance, ethnographic methods, and media theory. His work has been supported by the Winter-Gren Foundation and lots of support from Columbia and from Appalachian State University. He's done a tick over 2 decades of field research now in Honduras, starting in the late 90s. Which you'll be hearing a lot about this evening. Principally, the work has been on gang communities in Honduras and their reinvention of political subjectivity and the deconstruction of everyday notions of law, beauty, violence, including lots of tattoos, amazing tattoos. In addition to Gothic Sovereignty, there's a lot of other cool pieces that John has written that you should check out. A 2019 co-authored piece called Introduction to Monstrosity, which is in the Journal of Historical Sociology, and a chapter in the Punk Las Americas edition, which just came out late, I guess in December. A chapter edited by our own Shane Green and Company, entitled Sonic Agitation. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to John Horne Carter.
That was a great introduction. Thanks so much, Dan. I always forget in the beginning of these talks to do the requisite thank yous, and they come at the end, and I don't want to do that today. So I really appreciate the invitation. I live in a very parochial mountain town where I just like hide in my garden most of the time, and then come in to teach, and like have sort of come out of COVID like really unwillingly. And still clinging to like the insularity of my backyard. And I was driving up here and I was thinking, you know, I came, how many years ago was this? Like 7 years ago or something, or 8 years ago, I came and gave a talk on this project. And like academic work, sometimes, I think especially in anthropology, it just takes so long. And it's really rewarding to just be able to come back and share a little bit of this project with you. So thank you, Dan, for taking care of everything behind the scenes, and for the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies for funding me to be here, for Shane and Jeff, this generous invitation to both speak here and then to also speak with the Subcultures, Utopias and Revolution course. How many of you are in the course? I'm just curious. Okay, I mean, it's a lot. And so I know you've read most of the book, right? I mean, there's some people here who haven't, and what I was thinking as I got ready for the presentation was sometimes it's really different to read something twice, and I always feel like I don't really get something until I've read it twice at least, and that's very, very painful because, like, I don't know, there's just a lot to read, and so if you got to read everything twice, God. But there are some folks here who haven't any familiarity with the book, and so let me do a little introduction, and then I want to read from chapter 5, which is a chapter called Danger. And this is the end of part 1 in the book. The book's divided into 3 parts, and there's a big setup in part 1. It's like, I'll talk about it in a moment, but Chapter 5 is a chapter where things kind of like start moving into the ethnographic realm with much more immediacy, and you'll see what I mean. It's just so great to be out of my house. I'm really happy to be here with you. The crystallization of everything that I thought I was doing never really happened in fieldwork. And what does happen in ethnographic fieldwork is that you end up somewhere that you didn't really realize was even there. And this is what I think distinguishes ethnographic fieldwork from other types of like qualitative research, or archival research can be almost like this too, because you can discover documents that it just inverts everything that you've been sort of assuming about whatever the topic might have been. But I came in, I never wanted to study gangs. Like, this was not a topic for me at all. I didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, but like, it was only because of its descriptions, and no offense to any sociologists in the room, deep respect for, and I'll talk about that today, like the kind of tradition of gang studies in sociology, but the way that it was presented in sociology was like borderline criminological to me. It was always thinking through juvenile delinquency and always thinking through like how to normalize somebody. And I mean, sorry, I just grew up like, I'm like a kid who was forced to go to church too much, and like just grew up in a neighborhood full of sort of like upwardly aspiring white suburban kids in Raleigh, North Carolina, who were just racist and like awful, and I hated them. And so the whole idea of like taking someone who's like a misfit and then making them normal, I had no words for it in the beginning, but I was like, that's not the discipline for me. And I felt like as the gang scenario that you're all familiar with from reading the book, like boiled up in Central America in the late 90s, early 2000s, that I was painting myself into a corner, because it was fascinating in the sense that what a sociological definition of a gang was in my mind, and I was kind of wrong too about this, but I thought that this was a sort of very static definition of like a franchise that just, it's basically like folks who have a position of power, that they can kind of condescend to the underclass and be like, you're doing things incorrectly, whether it's like raising your children or like, participating in the illicit economy. And they're just continuously like keeping them over there and like having sort of very self-satisfied condemnations and like self-righteous discourses about how to fix things over here. But in Central America, like the gang world was, as you know from the book, very, very diverse and like electrifying, and it was not like my high school. It was not like what I understood from the media or even like cinema in the US. These were super creative collectives of young people who were like basically living in, what in kind of like common parlance are called like shanty towns on the sides of hills, but we'll just call them like marginal barrios, like marginal neighborhoods, very poor, sometimes unincorporated into the city, precariously situated on hillsides. And they were turning these kind of drab environments into like just almost like cartoonish in the best way possible. I don't mean that in a dismissive way. They were making life kind of cartoonish and exciting and like unbelievably kind of marvelous. I mean, in the sense of the marvelous in literature. But I didn't find many resources in sociology, and fewer people in anthropology were writing on gangs. So it's like, the literature was not really there, and that's problematic when you're young, because you feel like you need somebody to grab onto to kind of like quote and like guide you. And I sort of stuck with this theme because I was thinking something's going to come around, and in ethnographic research, what comes around is like you just realize that you don't understand things. And you don't understand things because you bring into it a lot of ideas that just get in your way. And the moment that really started to happen to me, where things started to unfold, was in 2005 when Erlang Culindres, who was a 13-year-old kid who lived in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, which is where I was doing fieldwork. It's a medium-sized Central American capital. It's in a kind of a bowl-shaped valley. It's like traffic is a nightmare, but it's a super, super charming place if you hang out long enough, which I did because I felt like Guatemala City's too unmanageable. It's like freaks me out. Managua was just like too spread out. San Salvador is too dense. Like I just felt like I don't know. Tegu's like put me at ease, and so I just ended up spending time there as a kid in the 90s, like not really knowing what I was doing, and you know, that turns into research, that turns into writing, and I felt like if I can write a novel about this one day, great, and this is what happened. So anyway, it's 2005, and the first time I went there is 1997, so we're talking about this is 8 years later, and I get an email in the morning, sitting on the back porch of my parents' house. Actually, I was about to go down for research for a year. And very scared because at that point, like the MS-13 was very large, and the Barrio 18 was very large, and like the war on terror was extending into Central America in ways that were like creating a very, very difficult environment for everybody, but especially for gang members who were like forced either to flee the country, go into hiding, die at the hands of police who were licensed to kill them, or spend time in prisons. And so like hanging out with gang members on the street was no longer this kind of like free-flowing sort of creative exercise. I mean, gangs were fugitive communities at this point. And what happens is I get this email, and it's a link from a friend, and it's about a DEA agent, Drug Enforcement Administration agent, who was murdered, strangely enough, in front of the chapel of the Virgin of Suyapa, who's the patroness saint of Honduras, but also of Central America more largely. At least Hondurans will tell you that all the time. And this is the most sacred site in the country. It's a place in Tegucigalpa that I've been to many times because I was fascinated with the idea that, you know, a 3-centimeter piece of wood could be like the focal point of an entire nation. I don't know, that alone just tripped me out. It's like I'm glad I'm an anthropologist because there's small things like that in life that like they're worth thinking about, and you know, this is a space in which that can happen. And I would just sit there and gaze at it, right? I mean, it's just like tiny, tiny saint. And it was in a chapel behind this like big cathedral that was built later. But the chapel has a plaza in front of it, and then hillsides of shanties behind it. And the kids who grew up in those neighborhoods protected the plaza and felt that the Virgin of Suyapa also protected them. And I didn't know any of this. I was working on the other side of the city. But I'd been there, and I knew that, you know, there were gang members like watching the plaza. It's very obvious. And I thought that was interesting. But I'm not an anthropologist of religion, and I was just thinking like about the political history of gangs and, you know, the 80s and Cold War and Contra War, the war on drugs. I was kind of in another zone. So the news report is that this 13-year-old had murdered a DEA agent. And it struck me as very wrong because gangs just victimize in Tegucigalpa the powerless. Like, it's stupid to victimize someone of the middle class or especially upper class, but like, then you move into the tourist realm, like you're definitely not doing that. I mean, that's just gonna be like police investigations. You victimize the powerless, right? I mean, because there's just impunity at the level of like 99% a lot of the time in Honduras around these kind of street crimes. And especially a DEA agent, right? I mean, somebody who's undercover, they're not very undercover. I mean, you know, they're sort of, this person was 45, and I remember at the time thinking like, damn, I mean, you know, that's like, he must have looked pretty old. I'm 47 now, so like, you know, I'm looking at this differently, but I'm sort of like, he was younger than me when he got killed. Anyway, I just thought like a 45-year-old white guy from California with a briefcase and a camera coming into this square, being approached by 2 gang members who are very young, who rob him at gunpoint, shoot him, and then he collapses back into a taxi as they struggle to get the briefcase out of his hand. So unusual. And I'm also just realizing this means that the entire like security apparatus of the United States is going to, you know, the one that responds to Central America, is just going to militarize public space in Tegucigalpa as I'm going down. And it's just going to make everything miserable for everybody, but also forget an anthropology project. Like, forget being in your early 30s, white, male, walking around asking people questions about gangs. No one's talking to you at that point. So like, I just felt like all this effort's like out the window. I got down there and I just thought, you know, it's too kind of red hot, and I can't pursue it. Like I'll just stick in the neighborhood where I've been working. But it never left my mind, and I began to think, like, I mean, there was something about the way that this particular individual was captured, a 13-year-old. I mean, and I'll talk about it more in the Q&A, because it's not really in this part of the text I'll read, but the way that this child was showcased as like the incarnation of everything that's wrong in the world. And especially as this individual was blurred, like the face is blurred. You can't really see it as well in this one, but you can see it here. Let me go back, here. Because, you know, there are laws around like criminalizing someone before trial, especially a child, and you couldn't see what he looked like, but he was called El Chelito because he was light-skinned and he had kind of blondish hair. And this was also kind of the other like element that really like got to me a little bit. I mean, because to me, it was immediately obvious that they were calling this person a devil when in fact they appeared like a kind of cherubesque figure. They appeared like an angel. This is a kid with like flushed red cheeks, blonde hair, and just very diminutive and seemingly innocent. And like the contrast was jarring. And I just thought, you know, as an ethnographer, I got to stick here. I mean, I'm thinking here. I don't know how to approach this, but I'm going to read a bit about the way that this happened and the way that I eventually did sort of move into thinking with the underworld that Erlen Colindres, who's the 13-year-old here, lives in, rather than kind of thinking about it from a distance. And I think this is the difference that I want to focus on. And as I read this chapter, which a lot of you have read, let's think about it, because we're going to have a conversation following this talk. And when you're hearing it for the second time and hearing me read it, like really look for what you didn't see the first time. Because this kind of recursivity in fieldwork is also very important. Like looking back at your field notes and realizing that when you first encountered something, you couldn't take it all in. But when you go back and you reread your own reactions and field notes, you start to see different stuff. And so you write in the margins. And this is why, you know, I start the book off with this picture of a fieldwork notebook, which has, you can't really see it, but those of you who have the book, it has writing on the page, but it's written with leaving the margins open. And I always write back into the margins because with different colored pens, because, you know, you go back to read something and you're like, it's missing these details that now I recall because it's bringing me back to the moment. And so the question is, memory's tricky. And like, how do we think about observation, like in the moment, in real time, observation looking back after we've forgotten so much of what's happened. I forget what it is, but after like, I've read, you know, pop science articles about like how quickly we forget everything. It's quite frightening, but after 2 weeks, I think, you know, on like an incident that's just kind of like a boilerplate everyday interaction, I'm reading that we forget about 85% of what's happening in that scenario. We're left with a kind of sketch. But the other information is kind of flushed out because the mind can't constantly just be like archiving all this information. We would just go mad. You can't remember everything. Anybody that remembers everything is sort of terrifying. And I say that because I have a friend who's like, that's his burden in life. He's like way too smart, scarily smart, and can quote books he read from like 20 years ago. And it's not a good thing. It makes people very uncomfortable around him. But so the rest of us dream about the kind of ephemera that might, you know, be in our unconscious that will flush out eventually. But it does surge back up from the unconscious in a lot of moments. And it surges back up through mnemonic devices like a fieldwork notebook. And so a lot of the writing here has to do with the fieldwork notebook as a kind of mediator for the process of understanding something. And this chapter and every other chapter in the book is written around a moment in which there was a turning point in fieldwork. Like when my previous ideas exhausted themselves, and it's painful because you feel stupid. You want everybody to always think that you're with it and like with them and like understanding them, and you can't go around the world like that. Like you have to accept that you just don't get a lot of stuff all the time, and then you're kind of in a better position to relate to others. But I mean, especially in fieldwork, the whole purpose is to figure out where you're wrong. And you can't really do that because it's like it's a blind spot. It's what Donald Rumsfeld notoriously called unknown unknowns. and I'm not quoting him in a nice way, things that you don't know. But that, through fieldwork, becomes clear. So let me talk about the experience of going to visit Erlang Colindres in prison. And I'm going to include some watercolors here because I'm working on some sort of non-representational illustrations to think through different sorts of mnemonic devices for fieldwork and ways of remembering what's happened to us that are not just like clear drawings or photographs or like, what we normally associate with illustrations or images in a book. It's like object X, it's very indexical. It's like, here is Erlang Colindres, boom, there he is, like a mugshot. I'm trying to get away from that and thinking about the space of writing as also a zone where ideas can fall apart and come back together without like tightening everything down into this sort of like very kind of exclusive read on reality. So here we go. I think this is, so we're at about 5 minutes to 7. Y'all mind if I read for about 30 minutes? And there's a lot of dialogue here. So like, if those of you who are unfamiliar, like, have no fear. Sort of like a novel. This is not turgid as other parts of the book. So it's a chapter called Danger. One of the constants of ethnographic fieldwork is that you start off with a handful of questions that you hope to answer by spending time with people over months and sometimes years, but then somewhere along the way the world redirects you. The questions that you started off with are displaced, and more astute questions arise from the context of research. This is why we hang out for so long, like years and years. People are like, why are you still here? It's like, I'm trying not to be stupid, and it takes a while. For me, that happened when the journalist Miriam Blanco, she's a journalist, and I met Erlang Colindres one Thursday afternoon in late 2006. This is a year after the shooting. We were on our way to the National Penitentiary where we had been doing fieldwork together for months, and I drove as she returned a list of calls and then suddenly snapped her cell phone closed. Change of plans, she says. What happened, I asked her. There was a massacre in Module 6 of the men's penitentiary. And so they're not letting anyone inside. I pulled to the side of the road. We were near the top of a ridge line in Tegucigalpa, and the city spread out below us beneath a haze that glowed in the sun. It had been a long day driving from office to office in the city. And sometimes driving to the penitentiary gave us time to think. Although being in the penitentiary is extremely tense, but I mean, so is traffic. I have to do a favor for someone there. No, I'm sorry. You want to go to Renaciendo, she asks. Renaciendo is the prison for minors that's in this carceral complex. In Spanish, it means rebirthing, literally, but I mean, in this context, it means like children who are reborn into the social world. For what? So why would we go to Renaciendo, I asked her. Typically, we avoided it as it was the center that was most difficult to navigate in the country. Since Erland's arrest, it had garnered a lot of unfavorable media attention, and often the guards didn't respond well to visitors. I have to do a favor for someone there, Miriam says, but I can go alone. Well, what is it? I ask. Miriam was one of the few people I knew who went to the men's prison regularly, which was highly unusual. No one went to the men's prison unless they had to. There were always lawyers and human rights activists who traveled there occasionally to speak with clients or administrators, but Miriam went several times a week. This is how we sort of fell into hanging out together. Like, this is not something that's done a lot. It's like going to the prison frequently. Part of it was her professional work, as she researched the details of certain inmates' cases and sometimes had cases thrown out or convictions overturned. But another part of it was personal, about her survival as a well-known whistleblower against government corruption and police death squads. She had endured years of anonymous threats, and months before I met her, she had been abducted by off-duty police, from whom she escaped by throwing herself from the vehicle on a major artery in the city. At the prison, Miriam mined inmates for information about police and white-collar criminals who formed the upper echelons of cartel organizations. She organized and saved that information on external hard drives that were hidden in several locations outside the city. If anything happened to her, she had friends who would deliver these to journalists to report on the hard drive's content. Among friends and enemies alike, her databases were treated like an urban legend. Only a select few knew if they really existed, but after months of shadowing her, I couldn't imagine that they did not. She spent far too much time finding out exactly the kind of information that would protect her if one day she needed it. I mean, she's a really, really intense muckraker. But this was about, protecting oneself through blackmailing and public shame. Last night, before I went to sleep, my phone rang, she says. I didn't know the number, but a good thing I answered it because it was Erland Colindre's mother. Miriam looked at me, anticipating my reaction. She was worried because she hears a lot of different things about him, and I promised I would go by one day this week and check on him. There were a lot of rumors that he was being tortured in the prison, that there were certain people in the country who wanted to keep him quiet. No one knew why he was involved in killing a DEA agent in broad daylight. Should I stay back? I asked her. I don't want him to think that I'm a US agent who's just come to harass him. No, I'll handle introducing you, she said. Okay, so I nodded. Well, let's drive fast, she says. It's almost 3 o'clock. We crested the hill and Tegucigalpa disappeared behind us as a pine forest enclosed the road on both sides, and we plunged down the hillside. I swerved around potholes and pumped the brakes, making sure that they were working properly. Miriam was obsessive about her car, certain it would be sabotaged if we weren't careful. Any mishap would leave us stranded and for a moment vulnerable. There were too many ways to do it. A slightly punctured tire would eventually go flat, loosen the lug nuts and a wheel would fly off, a small puncture to the radiator would overheat the engine, loosen the oil pan or plug a tailpipe and the engine would seize up, snip the brake lines, the brake fluid would drain out. As I drove, Miriam made calls to families of prisoners, and I'm freaking out about the car. I'm just like, these are very steep roads. And if somebody snipped the brake lines, we're going off the side. If we're stranded out here trying to change a tire, someone could easily drive by and just throw a large object at us. She was very kind of descriptive in the ways that we could always be preyed upon. So Miriam is making calls to prisoners, the families of prisoners at the penitentiary, updating the families on her investigations. She thrived on overturning shoddy police work, but she spent most of her time chatting informally with inmates, taking notes, and piecing together stories over weeks until something came into focus. Much of the time it seemed that little separated my ethnographic work from her version of investigative journalism, adapted as we both were to the criminal underworld. She approached secrecy and euphemism with the kind of patience and careful listening that allowed stories to emerge at their own pace. She never focused on anything, she never forced anything and tried to read evasiveness and distraction as their own forms of communication about a realm of knowledge that was potentially lethal. This to me was very instructive. Not trying to constantly get to the bottom of something, but to just watch what's happening in front of you. Look at strategies of communication. Think about that as cultural material as much as any kind of sort of ultimate answer that one is after. Being present as a researcher. At the bottom of the mountainside, the highway cut across the valley where sunlight streamed through fast-moving clouds. The smell of roasting coffee beans filled the car from factories miles ahead. To our left were small farms, and to our right was Villanueva, where hundreds of families displaced by Hurricane Mitch had been relocated into a grid of cinder block homes. After that, miles of empty countryside. We passed several corporate assembly plants where crowds of workers waited outside for the afternoon buses back to the capital. And eventually I saw a single prison guard in a blue uniform sitting with a rifle across his lap on an unmarked road. We turned and drove down the rugged road past empty cattle pastures until the hillsides parted and the men's prison came into view. The outer checkpoint was always unstaffed and the bar raised. Across the parking lot were 3 police cars and a van from forensic medicine. We stopped at the entrance to an access road that led to the prison for minors. Miriam handed the guards a government identification card. Gangs expert, the taller guard said to the other. They looked at the ID, then back at us, and slowly returned it. The taller guard waved us forward, smirking as we passed. Miriam used that ID card often. She said it could get her into any room she wanted. To be a registered expert on gangs meant knowing the gang world with an intimacy that frightened most people. They stayed as far away from gangs as they could and anyone who knew them. Why anyone would spend their lives learning about something so many found horrible was a mystery that they didn't care to resolve. On the access road, we passed the Barrio 18 barracks. So there are two gangs here that I'm really talking about. One is the MS-13, and the other is Barrio 18 or Calle 18, adversarial gangs against, between whom there are many, many vendettas and a lot of tension, to put it mildly. The building, so their building is outside the prison itself, was outside the main prison to isolate them from the MS-13 and frustrate their mutual vendettas. Barrio 18 inmates had converted an old factory building where prisoners once wove fabrics to be sold in the capital. And when they took it over in the mid-2000s, they painted the building black with Gothic lettering on the front that's the height of the building, XV3, 18. Guards stood around the outside while gang lookouts lurked on the rooftop, keeping an eye out for military vehicles coming from the highway, expecting a prison massacre. Honk the horn, Miriam says, looking up, and I did. Several of the silhouettes raised their hands. They knew her vehicle. If we don't come back, at least they know where we are, she says. Renaciendo was a rundown affair at the back of the penal complex, past rolling hills with vacant surveillance towers and unstaffed checkpoints. It was an unmarked one-story building that looked abandoned were it not for a guard sitting by the road. I stopped the car. We're closed for the day, he said. I'm here to see Erlen Colindres, Miriam said, holding up her government ID. And him, he said, looking at me. He's a journalist from France, no Spanish. I looked at her incredulously. You will have to leave his ID here with us, he says. Use your passport, Miriam said to me under her breath. I handed it over. The guard looked at it. Of course, it's a US passport. You said he's French, the guard says. He has dual citizenship, she says. The guard smirks and waves us through, and Miriam curses under her breath. That was incredibly stupid, she says. So why use my passport when I have other ID cards, I asked. Because I don't want them to think you're here long term, she says. It's better to act like you're just visiting the country and then leaving. Well, so why'd you lie about that, I asked. Because here they hate gringos. And if we want to see Erlen, then they cannot know you're from the States. I mean, the United States reaction to the assassination of this agent was like very extreme. And so the sort of level of kind of intervention resonated through bureaucracies as much as all the way down through the criminal underworld. Like it was a lot of overreach on the US's part. So it's uncomfortable to show up here being from the US. They cannot know you're from the States. They'll think you are from the FBI. So just stand behind me, and no matter what they say to you, don't talk. Do you know French? A little, but not much. Okay, it doesn't matter. Just keep your mouth shut and I'll get us in. Inside, two guards sat at a diminutive school desk made for children. There was no furniture in the lobby. Miriam introduced us and flashed her government ID. The ranking guard leaned back and rolled his eyes. Miriam smiled and explained that Erlen's mother had called her and asked if we would check on him. His mother is sick and can't travel, she said. We'll just be a few minutes. But the guard was impatient. Why should we let you in? What? She says. You human rights people call us torturers and murderers, don't you? Do you know what it's like to work here for years without even bullets for your gun to protect yourselves? Miriam tried to calm him, but he was just getting started. The other day, one of the puchos was mopping the floor right here where you were standing, and suddenly he tries to grab my pistol off the table. And how long do you think he had been planning that? Waiting, wanting to kill us when we were just trying to feed our families. She said her concern was the well-being of everyone in the center. If he could tell her what they wanted, they would write a report, and she would write a report and deliver it to the Ministry of Prisons. They know it all already, he says, laughing. Don't you understand? They take the money that could fix this place and send their kids to private school in Miami and New York. Then people ask why kids join gangs and don't respect the law. He stood up and picked up his keys. We could speak to Erlen, but we had to wait. They've been yelling obscenities at us all morning and all afternoon, and they need to cool down. Walk around a bit and come back. So I'm interested not just in this as a location where, Erlen Colindres is incarcerated, but as basically what we would call broadly a black site. This is a sort of very difficult place to access. It's it's a black box. I don't mean it's sort of repetitive language that I'm using here, but I think of it as a part of the sovereign apparatus that's like not meant to be fully understood. And it's the same with supermax prisons in the US. We don't have access to them. If you ever try to approach a supermax prison in Colorado or wherever you might find one on Google Maps, you're not getting in. You're not going to have a tour. It's not going to be like the early 20th century when people came from Europe to see the kind of modern carceral apparatus and all of its kind of technocratic and disciplinary beauty. Like the idea that you could rehabilitate someone without, hanging them or executing them in a public square, that this is what modernity was about. It's about reshaping people who had gone astray, deviated into citizens, into productive citizens. But we all know that that's not what prisons in the US are known for. And I'm interested in Renaciendo as one of these places where children are not rehabilitated. It's a sort of a black hole. And one of the theorists that, I'm thinking outside of anthropology a lot as I work through this project, and one person that really influenced me a lot was a geographer from Berkeley named Trevor Paglen. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all, but he was a geography PhD student, and there's some really, his work just gets increasingly bizarre and like inexplicable. And for example, this is Area 51, in the Southwest. This is the notorious kind of Hangar 18 where alien bodies are kept. And I mean, this is the heart of like conspiratorial, I don't know what you would call this, like surrealist apocalyptic, sort of QAnon-ish, X-Files-ish. It's the real like noir flip side of modernity that's pretty amazing. I mean, it's very kind of seductive. And he's not photographing it up close because like who could? So as a geographer, he just looked at topographic maps, picked out some hilltops about 18 miles away, and took photographs of Hangar 18 using astrophotographic equipment. So equipment that's used to photograph things in outer space. He's focusing on like landscapes at a very long distance. And this is strategic. I mean, he's producing images that don't really reveal the secret. And he's asking us to think about the kind of way that mystery is constructed, like the way that the mythology of the modern state both conceals itself and reveals itself constantly. And he's doing it without saying, I figured out what's in Hangar 18. I mean, that's a very lame story. The better, more exciting story is you can look at it and it leaves you desiring to know. It leaves you thinking, I mean, what is the kind of magic of the state that kind of circulates among us that we're both thrilled by and upset by? It's the reason why this is always like a recurrent theme in cinema and other types of, for-profit artistic representations. We can't get enough. And so thinking about Renaciendo, I'm asking, not like how can I create some sort of like fantastic allure around it, but like how do you do justice to that allure without going in like a human rights reporter and just saying like this place fucking sucks? I mean, as anyone would tell you. This is how many people died. This is how many people have ringworm. This is how many people, this is like how sort of lack of supervision leads to just a string of different kinds of human rights violations behind closed doors. I mean, that's one type of reporting, but I think for the anthropologist, the question with Renaciendo is like, why does it become this super powerful place for young people? Because it was. I mean, it's a place where a lot of young people grew up, spending a lot of time, and it was a sort of a commons for criminalized youth. So we're walking around. The interior of Renaciendo was like a school with open breezeways to three sides of a courtyard that led into an expansive field with a perimeter wall in the distance. Miriam and I walked slowly down the corridors, looking into windows of rooms filled with stacked furniture and boxes, each with a corroded padlock on the door that gave the impression none of the room had been utilized in years. We walked past the courtyard into a field and heard whistles from a nearby dormitory. More than 40 young people were inside, shirtless and sweating in the afternoon heat. An overwhelming smell of urine hit us before we were even close to the structure. Who's in here, Miriam asks. A crowd pushes against the bars. They were Barrio 18, several said, flipping hand signs and laughing. They wanted to know what we were doing, and Miriam said that we were human rights investigators auditing the prison. I stood back and Miriam did the talking. She had a warm and playful presence. "Write this down," they were yelling at her, offering a litany of accusations about misspent funds. First, they said, "Fix the pipes. That's why it stinks." Second, "Fix the kitchen. Meals were given out only when the kitchen appliances worked properly." "What about shoes?" Miriam asks. All of them, talking at once, held up their bare feet, many of which were infected with sores. Despite the conditions of the cell, though, Miriam had the kids laughing. And as they spoke, I could see Miriam glancing toward a solitary structure about 50 yards away in the otherwise empty prison yard. As the conversation wound down, she pointed to it. "Is that where Erlen Colindres lives?" And this is the cell that was built for Erlen Colindres because he had grown up in and out of this institution and he knew how to escape it very easily. So they built what would be like the impossible, I don't know what you would call this. I mean, it's like you can never escape from this thing, and it's just a concrete cube. I mean, it's very poorly built, and all you really need is a chisel, and he escaped it. But anyway, it's terrifying looking. And this is during the War on Terror, and so it has a lot of resonance with this sort of black sites around the world that the US was using as sites for torture and interrogation. The US being very closely aligned with, Honduras being very closely aligned with the US in the War on Terror at that time. "Another kid lives there now," one of them said. "El Chelito lives with the Puchos." "He does what he wants in Renaciendo," another said, and they all laughed. So Miriam and I walked to the cell, and we could see that the door was open and the guard post was empty. Miriam paused and looked back towards the main building. The kids in the dormitory were silent and watching us. A breeze blew and funneled the dust from a makeshift soccer field into a small twister that dissipated some seconds later. And we walked to the door of the cell and stuck our heads inside. There was a boy sitting alone adjusting the dial of a small radio, and he looked at us unstartled. "Do you have batteries?" he asks. Miriam shook her head. "We can't get any good stations out here," he says. "Is this where Erlen Colindres lives?" Miriam asks. "He's with the Puchos," the boy said. "But can you bring us better radios? We need wire for antennas." And Miriam starts looking up, where Chelito was written in bold black letters across the ceiling. There was a montage of hand-drawn images around his name, flowers and roses with thorns. This is just one that I drew afterwards. It's from the ceiling. There was a montage of hand-drawn images around his name, flowers and roses with thorns, daggers with droplets of blood hanging from the blade, angels and devils floating around clouds in a sky with a sun and a moon, and assorted skulls, hearts, serpents, and revolvers drawn with a childish crudity. Miriam asked the boy if he had family, and he said they lived somewhere in Carizal, one of the largest barrios in Tegucigalpa. "Would you like for me to contact them?" she asked him. He shrugged and continued searching the radio dial. "If you bring us batteries, we can pick up better stations," he says again. The afternoon was getting on, so we walked back to find the guards. On our way through the courtyard, a boy emerged from behind a wall at the opposite end, and then vanished again. Then there were two others peeping over the edge of the roof, and I sensed that Miriam was nervous. "They say there are more than 150 kids here, but we've seen only 50, what, right?" I shrugged. "So where are they?" she asks. At the front desk again, Miriam asks about the boys we've seen. "They're MS-13, the guard says. They live in those barracks over there, but I can't let you in. They're impossible to deal with, the sewage piping is ruptured, and every time we try to get in to repair it, they think it's their chance to escape. None of us likes the situation here, but we are public servants and we have a duty." And he's saying this sarcastically. Miriam was writing in her pad, assuring him that human rights workers wanted the same dignity for guards as they did for the inmates. "Sometimes we fall asleep right here at the desk," he says, "from boredom, and then wake up scared because some kid could have killed us in our sleep. They don't feel the same kind of remorse that you and I do because all they know is abuse from their families, the police, and from living on the streets." And with that, he picks up his keys, starts walking the other direction. "Come on, the Puchos are waiting for you." The corridor ended in a round vestibule with several black metal doors. The guard pounded on one of them and opened it. Inside, a crowd had gathered, pressed against a second door of metal bars. In front was a taller adolescent boy who looked at us defiantly with a slight smile. There were countless small scars across his chest and smudgy tattoos on his fingers as he gripped the bars. Looking inside, there appeared to be no windows. Miriam asked basic questions she asked any time we were in a new prison. how many lived there, if they had enough to eat, if any with ailments had access to medical facilities, and I just stood back saying nothing, as Miriam wrote down names and the phone numbers to call their mothers on the way back to the city. Bonjour, they yelled at me as the guard pulled the door closed. He went to the next metal door and pounded on it, and then opened it. Inside was a dark chamber where two boys stood a safe distance away. One was tall and lanky with dark skin and curly hair. The other was short with fair skin and brown hair. El Chelito, the guard says, stepping backward and looking over his shoulder down the corridor. We stood in the doorway as Miriam explained our visit. They both looked at me without smiling and then looked at the floor. And Erland thanked Miriam, said he was doing fine, and that he'd be living in this cell with Ruben, his cellmate, who was also from the Puchos. Miriam was staring at him and he met her gaze. Maybe you can let us inside for a few minutes, she says to the guard, if it's okay with them. They agreed and stepped back. 10 minutes, the guard says. If you can close the outer door, Miriam said. So he shut the metal door, and the warm glow of a single bulb lit the stuffy interior. We stood awkwardly. Ruben offered us water from a cup sitting nearby, and they cleared off the single mattress against the wall, and we sat. So you know my mother, Erland asks. She called me, yes, Miriam says. You used to have workshops in our neighborhood, Erland says, where you would bring the sound system and the rappers could say the rhymes in public. Ah, you were there, she exclaims. Yeah, everybody loved that, he says. We always wanted to come to your library. She had a kind of a NGO, like a non-governmental association with a great artistic, like a library of art books that everybody who lived on the street was free to come and sort of like be tutored in basic drawing and painting, art therapy. I think I saw you downtown sometimes, Miriam says, with other boys who lived in the river, lived near the river by the Congress building. Yeah, that might have been us, Erland says. The conversation lulled and Erland looked at me. We stared at each other, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Miriam's telling everyone I'm from France and I don't speak Spanish, I said in Spanish. Erland smiles. She said it so we wouldn't scare you, and I wiped my face with my sleeve. It's okay, Erland says. I'm a gringo, but I'm a university student, and I just wanted to come because I felt bad for what happened to you. Well, thanks, he says. I want to tell you that there are people out there who don't know you, but we worry that you're okay. It's okay, Ruben said. We're glad you're here. He's helping with me all the time now, so you can trust him, Miriam says. They nodded. We're moving everything from my office in Tegucigalpa to the inside of the barracks called Casablanca. This is where the kind of regional mafia was, barracks of like low-level cartel groups, but Casablanca is like a nod to DC as this like seat of imperial power. So for the cartels, like the best you could do in terms of like you know, getting Honduras in the palm of your hand was to be just like the Casablanca in Washington, DC. So Miriam's moving her office into the interior of this barracks. You know, the police broke into my office and vandalized everything. They destroyed what we had there. Yeah, we heard about that, Ruben says. It's a shame, Erland said. People trusted you. They weren't afraid to go there and ask for help. Well, we'll be nearby, and if you boys ever need anything, it's just like our office in Tegucigalpa, but it's in Casablanca where the police can't steal our files. You just send us a word and we'll come over. They nodded and we sat in silence for a moment. So how is everything right now, Miriam asked, lowering her voice. Is there anything that we can help you with? Erland looked at us and then lifted his shirt. There were fresh scars streaking across his stomach and circular wounds on his chest that looked like burns. He pulled the collar of his shirt to the side and there was a thick scar between his neck and his shoulder. Under two rocker-style leather wristbands, there were poorly healed lesions that suggested he had been tied, and I felt my head filling with blood, my vision blurring. I turned away and stared vacantly into a dark corner of the room. I could hear Miriam asking them if they needed help, and Ruben was still doing all the talking. Suddenly he raised his voice so that the guards outside could hear him. We don't give a fuck about these pigs. Every day they try to break us, withholding food, not giving us water, threatening to tie us to a tree and leave us for the MS-13 to do what they want. But we're the Puchos, and this is El Chelito. How can we be scared of anything? We're warriors. Erland reached over and put his hand on Ruben's shoulder, smiling. Ruben took a breath and looked at us, speaking quietly again. This is a big cell for two people, right? He says. I nodded. There used to be 5 others in here with us. A week ago, we were sleeping, and there was a sound up there like a monster. He pointed to a narrow aperture near the ceiling that was the only source of fresh air in the room. There was a man up there wearing some kind of mask, like a demon. None of us moved because kids will tell you that there's spirits here, bad ones. But then later that night, the door opened and they grabbed 5 of us, put bags over their heads, and they took them, and no one knows if they're alive or dead. Again, Erland seemed to stop him. We can give you their names, Erland says. Maybe you can check with their families or check at El Carmen, the other juvenile detention center. So Miriam wrote down their names in her notebook. But out here, whatever happens, Erland says, we can handle it ourselves. So tell my mother not to worry. Okay, Miriam says. She looked at her watch. I'll speak to your mother. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, just for sake of time. They dance to the radio. It's a sort of uplifting moment, but it's in a very sad context, and we leave. Outside in the parking lot, dusk was approaching. I lost track of time in there, Miriam said. We need to get back. Like driving at night. It's not good on this highway. We stopped at the security checkpoint on the way out, and Miriam said goodbye to the guard and asked for my passport. He opened a drawer and then looked under a notebook on the desk. Yeah, we don't have any passport, he says. Miriam stared at him and then insisted we had left it there. It must have been the other guard, he replied. They went back and forth. Miriam was arguing with him that there had been no change in the shift. It was the same guy in the booth. She turned quickly. Go now, she says. Get the hell out of here. I accelerated out of the parking lot. Go that way, she said, pointing to a side road. We can't go back the way we came. I drove fast down the dirt road, and soon we came around a curve and turned onto the paved highway back to Tegucigalpa. Miriam was checking the mirrors and scoping out the road ahead of us. What was going on, I asked. I couldn't hear what the guard was saying. She looks at me with an expression I had never seen before. Those guards just stole your passport. That's what happened. Why would they do that, I asked. What I want to know is this, she says. How can they do that? She looked at me solemnly. I thought you were protected by the embassy. I was confused. What do you mean? No one protects me? I don't have any protection like that. But you were in Honduras doing research on gangs. How can you not be protected by someone? I still didn't understand. Who would protect me? I asked her. The FBI, the CIA, for example, people who want to know about gangs. I don't work for the US government, I said. Be careful driving, she says, pointing to the road. Like I said, I don't work for the US government. Well, that's clear now after the guard stole your passport. I can't believe that I let this happen. What a fucked up situation. She looked out the window. You let this happen? I said. And then Miriam was annoyed. He took your passport. Now people know who you are. They know we were talking with Erland Colindres. I would never have gone out there if I knew you weren't with the US government. Jesus, I said, why would you work with me if you thought I was an agent like that? I mean, this is the goal, it's like not to be an agent. Because I'm not scared of your country, and there are agents everywhere down here. You have to get to know the enemy. You think we didn't do research about you when you first emailed me? We can find out things just like your FBI. Well, so what did you find out? That I'm a student? I asked her. We didn't find anything. And so? That might also mean you're a new agent and there's nothing about you. Oh, my God, I said. Anyway, it's not about the guards. What then? I'm lost. Don't you know the gringo who used to be in charge of everything at Renaciendo? He's one of your compatriots after all. No, so who are you talking about? Frankie Stearns. You've never heard of him? I don't think so. He was a consultant to Renaciendo until just before Erland escaped last year. When Erland committed, supposedly, the day that Erland committed this crime in Tegucigalpa was the day after he had escaped from Renaciendo. And so there was a lot of sort of speculation on why so quickly this had happened after he had just escaped from this juvenile detention center. So Frankie Stearns was running it when he escaped. He was a consultant until just before Erland escaped last year. The First Lady vouched for him. So you're saying you don't know who I'm talking about? No, I guess I was in New York and I didn't hear about it. I wasn't paying attention to prisons back then. I never planned on coming to the prisons until they locked up nearly all the gang members I used to talk to. Well, the guy I'm talking about has a neck like this. She puts her hands out like the circle of a tree trunk. Everybody thought he was some kind of US agent, but he said he was an evangelical pastor. The first time we heard him preaching, he starts off, I was in the CIA, I used to be a hitman, I was an alcoholic, I used drugs, cocaine, marijuana, and then I found God. This is the guy who had full access to Renaciendo anytime he pleased. So now do you see how Erlang Colindres escaped and a day later he killed a DEA agent? Why? I asked, still confused. Oh hell, Miriam said, looking at me. Because your own countrymen gave the orders. You think he's really a pastor? People say he's into all sorts of things. And that agent from the DEA must have known something about it. That's how an agent gets killed, not because two kids want to rob a gringo in broad daylight. We were cresting the hill, and Tegucigalpa spread out across the valley. In the distance, we could see the Suyapa Cathedral, which is where the assassination happened, glowing as the sun receded behind the ridge. Headlights were appearing on the beltway, and I was lulled by the panorama when a boy appeared from the side of the road and rolled a tire into the path of our car. Miriam screamed, and I crashed into the tire. Our front headlight exploded. The car lurched sideways into the oncoming lanes of traffic where another vehicle dodged us, and I brought the car back under control again. What was that? I said in shock. Miriam was looking in the rearview mirror, and I could see the boy scrambling up the hillside, and he seemed to be smiling. Damn it, we should have taken the back road, she said. What do you mean? They're sending us a message, she said, looking at me. That had something to do with Renaciendo? I asked, and Miriam laughs. What do you think? Has that happened to us before all the times we've driven this route home? She was shouting at me. This is a small country and word travels fast, she said. How many kids from Renaciendo do you think they could call to try and scare us on our way home? We descended the ridge in silence. Miriam pointed to a shopping mall, one built along the Beltway to serve the outer, poorer residential districts. Go there, she said. At the door, armed guards were frisking several young men, a protocol to keep gangs out. There's an internet cafe on the first floor, Miriam said. I want to show you something. The gleaming floors and bright lights were a shock to the senses after spending the afternoon in Renaciendo. In a dim corner of the lower level was a cyber cafe that was empty except for a few teenagers in Catholic school uniforms laughing at social media. Miriam sat down and entered the URL of a site that was accessible only by direct entry. She could type like lightning. You have to know how to archive everything, she said. Do you? I didn't know what she meant. One of the kids who worked at our office was a hacker, and he showed me how to set up a vault in the dark web where only hackers can get to it. Most of the police in this country are too lazy to find it. We should have scanned your passport and put it there. What should we do? Go to the embassy tomorrow, I asked her. Well, first I want you to see, she says, who you are dealing with. She searched Frankie Stearns and CIA and hit return. There were message boards with dense pages and then grainy photos of a clandestine weapons lab from the 1980s. The text was a detailed and spiraling narrative about a vast conspiracy theory that I had stumbled across before as I read about the history of US covert operations and the Contra War, though I couldn't remember many of the details. This is another artist that I've been really interested in because it's a sort of non-representational representation of like the conspiracy world. And this is from I think Lombardi's doing this in 1996? No, it's 1999. And he died shortly thereafter. Jeff, do you remember when this was?
I remember it, but I don't remember.
Yeah, he's a depressed guy, as you would be studying this kind of stuff. But he drew maps, visual representations of vast kind of conspiracy lore. And this is the map that he drew about the US intervention in Honduras to overturn the Sandinista revolutionary government in Nicaragua during the Reagan years. And the reason that it's so complex is because funding for the war was cut, and the anti-communist crusaders within the Reagan administration then just went into clandestine networks to continue funding the war. So you have anti-communist backers from all over the world running money through shell companies that can't be traced. And it becomes this kind of very elaborate thing that Lombardi is like making into a refined artistic object. But I think the tension that's so very interesting to me here is that it's so painful to try to figure it out. It's such a morass. I mean, Contra, I've like been thinking about it since, I guess, the beginning of grad school when I realized I had to grapple with it. But I saw Oliver North testifying and like in the congressional hearings when Reagan was being held to account and claiming to have Alzheimer's. And no one was talking, and it was just like, you can't understand this thing. There are too many shell companies, there's too much, it's like the war in Iraq. I mean, the war in Iraq really, I mean, Contra pales in comparison in some ways, but it was called Iran Contra 2. I mean, because it was so complex with all these sort of private companies outside of official institutions like the CIA or the FBI or the US Military Department of Defense. So I'm thinking about how to represent conspiratorial thinking and reality without trying to solve it. I think that trying to solve it it's like a fool's task. What we really need to think about is why it's engrossing and why it's exciting and why people get into it. So going on. Message boards with dense pages. The text was detailed and spiraling. I couldn't remember many of the details from this story about Frankie Stern's past. The lab was initiated, this lab where he worked, by high-ranking FBI insiders on the sovereign land of a Native American nation in the Pacific Northwest, out of the reach of federal law. A location that gave them cover from federal law. The lab developed experimental weapons, some of which were supplied to the Contras. I didn't remember the name of Frankie Stern's, but he was described in the narrative as an ex-Marine affiliated with the lab. Read here, Miriam said, advancing the screen to the last page. Relations soured with the leadership of the tribal council, it stated, and a significant member of the tribal governing council was murdered. Stearns was the primary suspect and vanished before being apprehended. He lived in Nicaragua for years, Miriam said, on the run. So how do you know that? I asked her. You can hear it in the way he speaks Spanish, she said. He thinks he can hide it, but he's got a Nicaraguan accent. And she's laughing at him. I stared at the image, a grainy and low-resolution JPEG of his face, wondering where this was leading. So then in 2002, Miriam says, he arrives to Tegucigalpa and says he's an expert on trauma and drug addiction. But the important detail is this. If he's wanted for murder in the US and hasn't changed his identity, and yet the US Embassy knows he's here, why hasn't he been sent back to stand trial? My mind was totally blank. What does that tell you, she asked. They have some kind of understanding, I said. No, it means they don't have the authority. And if he has more clout than your embassy has in this country, then what does that mean? I still couldn't think. It means he's got security clearance that is higher than the ambassador. After a few moments of silence, I could see what she was suggesting, as everything snapped together in an instant. Stearns was the incarnation of the Gothic sovereignty, which is this term that this book is written around. The incarnation of Gothic sovereignty's historical returns. People within the apparatus of the state whose job it is to transgress the law. What do you do with them when the war's over? I mean, they have a very difficult time coming back on the other side and just becoming sort of non-sociopathic members of society. The war is sort of never over. They resurge in different historical moments. So you're saying that Stearns, being connected with Renaciendo, used Erland to assassinate Markey, the DEA agent. Miriam stared at me with no reaction. When foreigners like you come to Honduras, they have to learn, she says. It's like we all have the same instincts, but Hondurans have one more that you don't have. We have to know how to survive. We have to live with gangs, we live with cartels, and we live with the United States. So we have to be able to know things before they happen. People from other countries are sleepwalking compared to us. Ever since I'd met Miriam, I always felt several steps behind her, unable to keep up as her intuition seemed to arc out in front of us, decoding the world before it revealed itself. It didn't matter if we were at the government ministry, listening to testimony from victims of police violence, or attempting to evade rush hour traffic. She had powers of anticipation that I lacked. And that evening, as we drove to Los Piñares to drop me off, we drove in silence. I thought about her state of awareness, her ability to read the muted premonitions embedded in the social world, and those magnified by technologies and circulations in mass media. I felt inadequate as an ethnographer and as an anthropologist, and wondered if Miriam and I would even speak again after tonight. If I had no government ties that afforded her protection by association, I was a glorified chauffeur at best, and at worst, I was putting her in danger with my own ignorance. Ethnographic methods awaits this moment. I'm finishing up here. Where one's senses and one's intuitions reach their limits. As we drove to Los Piñares, I could feel my attention shifting, adjusting to an awareness of my own short-sightedness, lack of experience, and misreading of the world around me. The visit to Renaciendo had transformed the way that I thought not only about gangs, but about the underworld in which they operated. That underworld was not new, and gangs did not run it. It had deep histories and seasoned veterans who were skilled at remaining invisible in official narratives of US-Honduran relations. Frankie Stearns was one of them, and Erlan had entered his orbit. So too had Markey. Each of them, a covert operations professional, a young gang member, and an undercover DEA agent, lived their lives outside the visible and acknowledged social world of Tegucigalpa. They were inassimilable within it, each defying the self-same rational and calculating subject position at the basis of social life's familiarity and homogeneity. Such an ordering did not account for them. They were elements of what Georges Bataille, a French theorist that I'm working with kind of extensively here, describes as the heterological social realm, analogous to the unconscious. So if the social world is what we try, people in rehabilitation industries try to assimilate supposed criminals back into, we can think of that as a homogeneous realm, where we all understand the kind of terms. And the heterogeneous, or the heterological, as Bataille would call it, which is like extreme heterogeneity, as being this place that doesn't fit. And so the art of rehabilitation is to make them fit. Foucault calls this discipline, and I'm interested in thinking, on the other side of it, like how can we theorize what's on the exterior? And it's not just gang members, it's also people like Frankie Stearns who are just like, professional, they transgress by profession. Where the heterological social realm, analogous to the unconscious, where practices and individuals who did not fit the rational and prudent conventions of a capitalist life driven by efficiency and productivity are repressed until they arrive with scandalous disruption to the given world. Erlan Colindres disrupts that kind of everyday monotony. For Georges Bataille, the heterogeneous included everything resulting from unproductive expenditure. Everything rejected by homogeneous society as waste or as superior transcendent values. Included are the waste products of the human body and certain analogous matter, trash, vermin, etc. The parts of the body, persons, words, or acts having a suggestive erotic value, the various unconscious processes such as dreams and neuroses, the numerous elements of social forms that homogeneous society is powerless to assimilate, mobs, the warrior, aristocratic and impoverished classes, different types of violent individuals, or at least those who refuse the rule, madmen, leaders, poets, etc. Violence, excess, delirium, and madness characterize the heterogeneous elements. And I forgot to go through these, but I was going to say, thinking about these conspiracy narratives, you should look at Trevor Paglen's book on patches. It's very interesting. He collects patches from covert operations, not to sort of, again, like dive to the bottom of the ocean and come back up with the truth about all of this, but to think about representationally, what are they doing? I mean, these are patches, it's got a book of maybe like 60 of these, and they're given to people in black ops and covert ops, in the black budget of the military, who work in these clandestine locations, who run experimental projects. And these are like Boy Scout badges for people who just do like massively illegal things that like sort of construct the sovereignties of the future. And I don't know how he's managed to do this without, there's a question there about how he's managed to sort of photograph Area 51, get all these patches. But in finding people who trade these patches, he's managed to talk to people involved in covert ops, and he's interested in the exterior of their world, like how they, like what are their modes of secrecy. And the work that I'm doing in this book is sort of inspired by this, to think about gang members on the surface, not to try to psychoanalyze them like a criminologist, but to think like, what are they doing representationally? Like, what are they doing to fend you off? Like, what is this amazing exterior that you can't get past? Post Malone, like tattooing his face with tattoos here and there is like nothing compared to this. This is an extremely baroque, intricate commitment to never coming back on the other side. This is like never returning to homogeneous life. This is like heterogeneity forever, and it's going to be a short forever. So Bataille, Georges Bataille, writing in the 1930s, speculates that fascist demagogues would attempt to expose and yoke the heterogeneous into a political force. But in the late liberal societies of global capitalism, in which such elements are nonetheless still excluded from everyday consciousness, are the excluded elements of the heterogeneous not occasionally organized into communities of their own? This is a gang. Communities in which wasteful expenditure, sovereign power, and criminal recklessness coalesce into a separate economy, where abundance is valued over scarcity, where pleasure is valued over prudence, and where risk is valued over self-preservation. Is that what the criminal underworld was? When we hear about gangs, in quotes, in Honduras, were they the newest and most flamboyant social communities to take root in a heterogeneous sphere that long preceded them? Despite all the pearl clutching about gang violence, was the real scandal their theatricalized eruption into everyday consciousness that exposed a realm of contemporary life otherwise repressed? No one wants to think about it. Everyone wants to, from the middle class perspective, this is better off at solitary confinement. But gangs are forcing a public to think about why one would declare oneself criminal. Why politics is exhausted. So why inhabit this other side of the law? When Miriam dropped me off in Los Piñares, we agreed to go to the embassy in the morning and to report the theft of the passport. They're going to ask why we were there, and I doubt you want to mention Erlang Colindres, but we'll figure it out. She reversed the car and drove away. I stood for a few moments in the intersection as fireworks from a nearby birthday party exploded in the sky and illuminated the streets. The cascading thoughts that plagued me on the way back had subsided, and for a moment I felt a deep sense of connection to Los Piñares and to Tegucigalpa as it twinkled in the distance. Whatever I had been thinking for months leading up to this moment had been partially wiped away, and in the space cleared by its absence, I sensed the opportunity to be more present to the world around me. The intellectual baggage that I had arrived with felt lighter. That night, I stayed up late taking field notes for several hours until the streets outside were silent. Before bed, I looked back at the pages of my journal from a few days earlier, which read like they were written by someone else. I made notes in the margins with a different colored pen, reflecting on what in retrospect were clumsy and flailing attempts to find a toehold in research. Finally, I thought, fieldwork had begun. Thank you. I'll be here to take questions.
How much time do we have?
I think we can just open it up
Okay.
and just let it kind of go until it goes, basically, yeah.
Let it go till it goes.
Sure. Yes, in the back.
I apologize. I read segments of your book, but not the entirety of it. So I apologize if that.
Don't worry about that.
Went over,
Yeah.
and I missed it.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever have any instances of I really liked the image or the drawing of the face tattoos.
Uh-huh.
And you just the point that you bring, like the cultural markings of what it means to be a gang member. I don't know. It's really interesting. And what makes me think of also is like the use of tattooing with indigenous identity and indigenous culture. Is do you feel like you ever saw any conversations of in indigenous culture, indigenous identity, and personhood with these gang members or anyone that you were interacting with or talking with?
I can answer that in one way. It's probably not what you're looking for, but I think it does speak to it in a way, not directly, not in the way I think that you're thinking, but there was a lot of kind of Honduran nationalistic kitsch in these tattoos that might be like a set of Mayan ruins, or it might be like an animal from, a kind of forested area that's no longer forested. A sort of dream animal of the past that has to do with like the pre-colonial period. From like the tattoos that I'm looking at here, I'm thinking about is fragments of history, and because a lot of them are prison tattoos, they're familiar prison tattoos that go back to like the days of traveling carnivals and circuses in the U.S., where you have like biker gangs and sort of outsiders that's a society, right? They're like joining the circus and the carnival because they're outsiders and they're not welcome in small town America post 1950. it's difficult for them. So they're also incarcerated, and so you get these sort of kitschy tattoos that are not very sophisticated. And I'm interested in the way they travel. Like, I'm interested in the way that those reemerge at certain moments, and the kind of energy that they carry. I mean, I would call it affect, or the way that they sort of make you think as you look at them, because they don't offer you like a kind of easy read. But these images of the pre-colonial era, to me, were really fascinating, because they were anti-imperialist, while at the same time partaking of how can I put this? Appropriating the Spanish discourse of the Baroque in their own way, in this exaggerated kind of like non-Protestant. It's the sort of against the idea that one should be a responsible person who's like saving money and just like suffering in a part-time job just to not become a criminal. And so they form sort of texts which are disrupted constantly, right? It's not a seamless. It's not like a paragraph of prose. They're images which create relations between each image, and you can't kind of interpret a crying clown on its own terms, but you can think about the crying clown next to, I don't know, a marijuana leaf, next to a zombie, next to a flag of Honduras, as a sort of challenge to the way that one engages with everyday life and thinks about symbols. I mean, I think the kind of moment that always came back to me as I started to realize the way that these symbols were appropriated was Jimi Hendrix's performance of the national anthem at Woodstock. I just thought of that, like, as I got into this, I was thinking that's really, to me, like the political peak of the 20th century from this perspective, in terms of like working with something that's a staple and rearranging it and psychedelicizing it and challenging what it's supposed to mean in a very transgressive way, like not in a safe way, but like setting it free. And I often watch this with my class because Hendrix this is not a composition. I mean, it's a felt piece, and so it's not about the intellect. It's about the way that the body resounds with the guitar and the way the body resounds with the resonance of music. I mean, amplified tone, and it's a very I think, Enlightenment critique of like the U.S. as this place that has like a charter and a set of laws, and it's all like very well organized, and the legal establishment depends on that kind of organization to assert itself as a rational apparatus. The tattoos are doing the same work, and so the pre-colonial is a big inspiration, but as is the language of the Baroque. If you study the Baroque in different contexts, it's always doing this historically. It's like taking what's there, exaggerating it, making it clumsy, but in a great way. It has a sort of like primitivism that's insurgent. Yes?
Going in the same theme of tattoos,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned in the book about the use of kind of satanic symbols.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine that not necessarily they were Satanists, but but like kind of more of a, again, like a challenge, just this kind of middle class perspective of religion. But at the same time, you began your talk as talking about this little semi-penetration on Honduras. So can you talk a little bit more like their relationship with religion in that sense?
There's a chapter, I don't know if you all have gotten to it or if you'll read it, but there's a group from Florida who came in. I mean, they come in every year, and they're called Creciendo en Gracia, like growing in grace, or born in, coming up in grace. And their whole shtick, they're sort of like a one-trick pony, and they have a guru, and their critique of the Catholic Church is that they're misreading the Bible, and that when Jesus died on the cross, that all sins were forgiven forever, and so there's no such thing as sin anymore. Are y'all familiar with this group at all? They just blow your mind. What's that?
Only from your book.
Okay, and they would parade through downtown Tegucigalpa. I still can't wrap my head around this, but I saw it. So they're coming down the street using the middle finger as like their symbol, and they tattoo their kind of evangelical stamp, if you will, is to tattoo 666 on the wrists of their believers. And then their guru goes into the soccer stadium and like delivers a sort of speech in the evening to a full stadium. And it blew my mind. And their message is that you cannot be held accountable. Like, sin doesn't exist. So life should be about enjoyment. And they go to the prison at this stage where, you know, the satanic motifs have really taken over gang tattooing following some prison massacres in which gang members were. I think, you know, my read on this was that if the body was there to be destroyed by the state because gang members had no rights, tattooing the body extensively was like resacralizing or like returning a kind of sacred status to the body. And if law is the side of right, like, you know, correctness in life, and that's the mechanism of like your own annihilation, then the only position that you can take is evil. And so the tattooing of the body through evil motifs was a way to like re-sacralize and return meaning to the body. But, you know, this group from Florida is misreading it. And they're thinking like, we got to go talk to these Satanists in the prison because they really will get us. And when I got there later that afternoon, they had already been, and I got back to the MS-13 barracks, and I was talking to this guy who's, I mentioned him in the book, he's just like the most, they were like, he's so ugly, he doesn't need tattoos. And he didn't have them on his face. It's just like, his face is perfect for a criminal. He was sort of a, you know, ranking person. I just said, did they come out here? And he's like, oh yeah, I mean, like, what do they think they're doing? And I was like, oh yeah? Like, what do you mean? Well, they came, the gall, I mean, I didn't use that word, but, you know, like the nerve to come out here and think that, like, we worship the devil? And I'm, like, looking around, and, I mean, 666 across the forehead, and I'm like, so, yeah, I mean, right. Like, so what mistake are they making? And he's like, I'm paraphrasing, it's in the book, but, you know, he's basically like, how stupid do you have to be to really think that we're Satanists? Like, I mean, he's a Catholic, he's just like, I'm Catholic. Like, I mean, I couldn't possibly do that, right? It's so offended at the idea that they could be taken as Satanists. So you would see satanic tattoos side by side with, like, you know, the praying hands and like quotes from the Bible and other tattoos from different moments in life. But they weren't popular at the time that, like, the satanic motifs took over. But they were side by side in, like, non-contradictory ways. Like, they weren't, like, tattooing over them. They were meant to be integrated. So, I mean, I think that's a really important part of the book. You know, it's not that, I mean, they were throwing into question the whole idea of, like, this binary that's been constructed by law and religion. Being evil is not necessarily, doesn't mean that one is a sort of a reprehensible human subject. It's a political position. I mean, this question came up in another talk that I gave, and I think it's one of the most important questions from the book. Because the whole book is about this moral inversion the gangs are performing. And the reason that I wrote it is because, as I say in the introduction, like, the sort of fate of gangs in Central America is, like, it's very regrettable. Because this was very quickly effaced. I mean, just a couple of years later, they're not tattooing, and they were just working for cartels, and they're being way more clandestine. And so then you just get into the kind of the same industries. It's like whether you're on the kind of like capitalist corporate, like, side of, you know, side that's in the daylight, or you're on the other side that's just the state, you know, sort of managing narco trafficking and other kinds of illicit industries. You're still a kind of victim of the Industrial Revolution. And as the president of Honduras is, like, under extradition now for narco trafficking, like, the point's been made, right, historically, but people forget because gangs are, I mean, it really is intolerable to live around them now. And the book, I mean, I don't know, if this had not happened, I wrote the book a lot of the kind of intention behind the book was to address this forgetting. Like, you forgot that these people were tattooing themselves in devils because they really thought that you were so full of shit on the side of right and politics, and, like, calling them to do roundtables with the vice president or the minister of security in your corrupt government that was just making money off of them, you know. I mean, it's a very important moment, and then it just poof, and that's how history goes. It's just always moving. So I think, you know, part of it is to tell that story again before it's gone. Not to salvage it, but to say, like, there's a lot in it to think about, and it's to think about what, like, actually political power is going forward. It's not strong-handed security, which is what comes out of it. Yeah, Jeff?
So I'm wondering a little bit, I mean, partly I'm comparing with what I observed of gang culture in El Salvador, but sticking for the moment with your book, it seems that at this particular moment you're describing, with regard to tattooing and the confrontation with the state, that these folks, although they're criminals in a certain real sense, were not necessarily predatory in their own communities, and that their way of survival was not exactly, well, it might be somewhat parasitical depending on how you view drug culture, I suppose. But it wasn't predatory as it would later become, which you associate to some degree with their relationship with the cartels.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm wondering about is when do they start, cobrando renta? When do they start extorting from, let's say, small business like the neighborhood pulperia or venta? When does that happen? And so just briefly stepping over into El Salvador, it seemed to me that was the story from the word go.
Yeah.
Like, I don't remember a time in which the Maras weren't doing that, and yet they don't seem to have had a direct relationship, except maybe recently that I'm not aware of, with cartels. Like, they were, in that sense, kind of, they were they were transnational, but they operated locally, and they operated locally by basically extorting, the bento or the bakery or what have you. So I'm wondering if you could just.
This is a good question, because it helps put this into a timeline again. In the beginning, from the word go in Tegucigalpa, it was happening. Whether they were like, so that the question is like, how were gangs extorting local people in the early days, preceding this period that I'm describing is like a real shift into like preying on communities, this way that drives people into like massive migrant caravans leaving the country. They were, but it was a sustainable kind of extortion. It was like perceived as taxation. Yeah. Like, if you're in an unincorporated part of the city, you're not paying taxes to the municipality of Tegucigalpa to like develop your neighborhood. But gangs were like, look, we're keeping other gangs out. So just like give us some money to get by, give us some money so that we can arm ourselves, give us some money so that we can buy the stuff that we need to be happy, whether it's drugs or like throw a party. But it didn't put people out of business.
Right. Just to interject back again. I have talked a lot with people who live in Soyapango and Greater San Salvador, which is just completely a huge area, completely gang controlled. And they live under it, and they don't particularly suffer from it, because they're just workers, they're white collar workers or service workers. And they just live there. There's certain codes you have to obey. You don't wear certain colors. That's very important. But other than that, they're okay. It's different if you barely getting by in a business, perhaps. But there is that, which is probably similar. Yeah,
two things. One is that so there was a coup in Honduras in 2009, and this really threw the. It just opened the door for a lot of extrajudicial violence. And so gangs then were in a kind of a vacuum where basically impunity was 100%. No one was investigating any sorts of crimes at this point. The state was paralyzed institutionally because of a political crisis. And so at that point you started to see it. You saw rent go up. And I was asking people why. Why are people fleeing? Because, why are the gangs doing this at this point? What they were doing was not just coming by and saying, look, tomorrow, $50, right, from a business. They're coming to residences and saying, tomorrow, $2,000. And if you can't, it's a real problem. No, maybe not tomorrow. Give people 48 hours, 72 hours.
To get money sent from the States, right?
Right. To drain bank accounts of Hondurans in the diaspora, decimate the neighborhoods, because these gangs were no longer interested in maintaining their kind of credibility or their power within a local setting because they were already backed by cartels, and the money was going up into the cartel apparatus. That's the only, I mean, that's the reading from both. I mean, and also this is very hard to describe because you have to be at the sort of levels of command to even know this, right? But it was also that money extorted from local families was being used to pay off judges, and it really set up the kind of impunity that by 2014 creates the child migrant crisis, that you saw so many young people from Honduras fleeing to the US border, and people here were like, oh my God, the parenting traditions in Honduras must be like, can you imagine like a 7-year-old at the border, like walking all this way? And it's because they were recruiting children that age as spies. I mean, it was really, really panoptic and oppressive. Something like Soyapango, so like living in a very gang-controlled area where law enforcement is, I mean, they are paid off and non-existent. I went back, and I guess what Professor Gould is asking is, sort of how does this like domination and a kind of equilibrium coexist? When I went back in 2017 or something, I went down to my friend Victor's house. He's described extensively in the book, and he lives like right on a sewage canal. It's like his house was wiped out by a hurricane, and then he just lived in a shack. And he's got a lot of kids, and it was just tough. And I come back, and his kids are working age, and suddenly like the house is bigger. He's like, check this out, like close your eyes. And he brings me in the house. I'm already astonished because the outside is like stucco. What's going on? And come inside, he's like, check it out, it's just like your parents' house. He's like seeing pictures on Facebook. He's got like recessed lighting and like sheetrock. I'm like, how is this possible? He's like, no, you haven't seen anything yet. And we go in the basement, he's got a huge flat screen TV. And like back in the days, you wouldn't ever have that because it just means somebody's gonna come and take it. I mean, it's just an invitation for an incident. And I said, so explain what's happening, because I have no clue. And he goes, well, look, like the MS-13, like we've come to an agreement here. Like everybody's quiet about the MS-13 now if they can just sell their drugs. And just let them sell their drugs. And on the other side, you know, the MS-13 has like tighter control now over cocaine. This is all Victor. He's just like very into this. They have all the control over the cocaine in this part of the city. Across the river is Barrio 18. And they're kind of disenfranchised. Like MS-13's got the leg up right now, so they're just extorting families and like killing people in their living rooms. And you can just hear the weapons at night. But on this side of the river, if we just let the MS-13 deal their cocaine, everything's cool. And flat screen TVs, and my kids can go to work, and they don't get extorted at the bus stop. I mean, but when things are destabilized, like when it's quiet, the gang apparatus is working really well. When it's loud, things are problematic. You know, the gang's going broke, or like somebody's desperate. And that's when you can't make a living because you come home from work with money in your hand, you're robbed as soon as you get off the bus. So in Soyapango, it's like, I mean, it's a kind of a functional gang land. And the police are always involved. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering if you can speak more kind of to your sort of reflections on the usefulness, or I guess perhaps more importantly, the limits to the usefulness of semiotics as a means of kind of reading the surface of tattoos, but also mediated images of the rest. And just to kind of provide a little bit of my conceit of asking this question, one of the kind of grounding texts for this course, which gives us the concept of subcultures, is the Big Heritage Cultural Studies text, subcultures, where semiotics is used extensively to read fun. But there's this kind of, my understanding of it anyway, is that there's this awkward bind where Heritage both wants to understand what's beneath the surface, but also insist that there is this intentional opacity. And it doesn't really seem like he's able to work himself out of that bind. And my experience reading your book was quite the opposite, that you're able to sit with the surface and the importance of that really, and kind of experience the weight of the surface there. So I'm just curious if you can kind of talk about that process and how you came to formulate that.
I mean, this is a really great question. Initially, I wouldn't call myself a semiotician at all, but would tinker with it. I mean, I'm not trained in it in the same way that some other people are. So I don't want to get in that lane. But for me, it's read through Benjamin's theory of images and some from Roland Barthes, and then thinking about some of Nietzsche's comments on images from The Birth of Tragedy. But basically, like, this got me away from thinking about psychoanalytic histories of patients, and allowed, it shifted the kind of definition of what criminality was. I mean, because in the tradition of criminology, which you would just be surprised how kind of persistent this style of thinking is. I mean, it's all about pathology and trauma. And there's trauma, for sure, but trauma does not mean pathology. I mean, you know, trauma means a certain kind of relationship to memory and history and everyday engagement with other folks that is troubled, but it doesn't necessarily mean criminality. And so to get away from just like thinking about like individual subjects and trying to kind of find that place where they just got like, you know, where they socially deviated, in the language of sociology and criminology, who make this a very complex topic. I'm not trying to like sort of caricature that work too much, but I was definitely trying to get away from it because that was always the story. It was like, if we could just like fix them. And the images, so to get back to thinking about semiotics, the images, to me, the reason that the Baroque comes in like so much in this book is because it's in the Baroque that the symbol is this kind of like overflowing, like stupid object that like pretends to mean something, but you'd have to really be naive to think that it does. And its overflowingness is a kind of it works with contradiction in a very interesting way. So it both is and it is not. And it's that kind of relationship both to history and to oneself that I think, you know, moving through this kind of reading of tattoos and also of like their relationship to the book of Revelations, and there's a lot of this towards the end of the text about the way that one might look at rehabilitation as asserting a kind of continuous life history that's very much like always premised on being lost and then being found and being kind of you know, a sinner who's then redeemed. And looking at the layering of the book of Revelations as a place in the Bible where a lot of gang members found that very interesting, and like, you know, you find it in tattoos, the kinds of the place of monstrosity, I guess is what I'm saying, is not just about kitsch. And, you know, taking tattoos to this register of analysis for me was fun because I felt like a lot of my friends who were anthropologists that like had seen these tattoos were they were like hipsters about it. They were like, those are bad tattoos. Like, I have good tattoos. Those are really bad tattoos. I'm like, what is happening? So, like, bad tattoos are great the same way that like a child's drawing is like really amazing. You know, the same way that something that's, let's just go back for a second. We're taught at a certain age to stop drawing and to start writing. And I wanted to think through these images as a sort of undisciplined area of self-expression that really worked against what people were trying to do in rehabilitation, which was to reassemble the individual. And the whole point of the gang was like this range of potential that exceeded the historical conditions of the present. And you can't do that in a like Hebdige style, sort of like a more rigid idea of the symbol. And a kind of idea that like symbols all come together in this sort of way that like works structurally. I mean, I know Hebdige is more complicated than this, but Hebdige is not thinking about constellations of images as symbols that like each one sort of doesn't mean what it pretends to mean, but together they have a kind of illuminating potential in one's thinking that can cast light on problems that are like very difficult to write through in language. But they are easy to kind of intuit through images. And that's why propaganda and images remain, I mean, propaganda all the way to cinema, remain very powerful mediums that can be mysterious at the same time that they can be very, very suggestive in specific directions. And so, like, how do you read gang tattoos without doing this? I don't know if you've read Cesare Lombroso, but like to look at like an inventory of like criminal traits. Like, how do you read tattoos without being like, well, there's like this tattoo and that tattoo and that tattoo and that tattoo. And I heard about this manual of gang policing that, you know, it's like this rumored thing. It to me was the kind of post-capital, I don't know, it's like the late capitalist, like neoliberal nightmare version of like the torture manuals of the 1980s. These like secret manuals that police and death squads, you know, were received in U.S. military institutions that trained them in counterinsurgency and torture. You know, they came home with these manuals, and the manuals also like were passed around to like other folks, and they were like for the non-literate. They were like cartoon version, comic book versions of these manuals. Anyway, ephemera of the days of covert operations. The gang manual, people, oh, there's this manual that the anti-gang police force has, that the anti-gang detectives, but they'll never show it to you. But it's like all about like how to deal with the gang problem. And I thought this thing was like, you know, I really wanted to get my hands on it, and then I finally saw it. And of course, I mean, it's a disappointment, but it was a really, really amazing disappointment because they had just Xeroxed pages of tattoo magazines in the States and like stapled them together with this very bad cover of like a gang member like flexing his muscles, which is like 80% of every book that's written on gangs anyway. And I realized later that Miriam Blanco had put that together like as a prank. And you know, and she was just like these stupid I mean, she was very into like the stupidity of the institutions, which it's like one of the things that made her extremely exciting as a person to be in conversation with, because she just like believed that the state was this totally, it was just rotten with its own contradictions and like cognitive dissonance. And that manual, I've got a copy of it in my office. I can send it to you all. You just laugh at it, and it's nothing much, but it was dumb. And the reason it was dumb is because it just listed the kinds of tattoos. It's like, if you see this one, it means this. If you see that one, it means that. It's the same thing as going back to 19th century criminology, where they're like, if you have a sideways ear and a sideways nose and you have a lazy eye on this side, you're probably going to be like a mass murderer, like, but only in like, you know, within the family. I mean, there's just very like strange kinds of psychological interpretations of like how physiognomy related to like one's criminal potential. You should look at Lombroso's volumes of drawings. He just went into Italian prisons with portrait artists and drew portraits of criminals to look at to compare their faces and come up with like a quantitative reading of like how to predict who's going to break the law and like fix it before it happens. So I mean, there's a lot in that, but I mean that's the idea. It's like get away from thinking about the human subject as this thing that has a kind of continuous narrative that's consequential and like cause and effect is linear, and then not to like go the sort of like safety pin Hebditch route and think, you know, this tattoo means that, like the crying faces, like the theatrical faces, like cry now or like laugh now, cry later, like this kind of thing. It's because they were in Los Angeles and they were in jail in this particular place. Like to get away from that and just think like, not to do like a genealogy of that tattoo, and not to say like that the MS-13 is tattooing themselves in devils because they were like living in LA during a great moment in heavy metal history, which is true. And there's a lot from that that's written up in Juan Martinez's book on the MS-13. But to think like, what happens when these symbols are side by side in constellations? Yeah.
Another thing I'm thinking about is the location of a tattoo. Like, so not just like, so let's not like, if we're talking about face tattoo, we're not even talking about face tattoo, we're talking about where on the face.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's like, and so something that I feel like I've noticed in this photo and then from my other previous media stereotype perceptions of Latin American gang members is the upper lip tattoo,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting because you don't see that as much with like the other stereotypes of facial tattoos with like the SoundCloud rapper tattoos, or like you just like the like rock star, you know, you don't see the upper lip tattoo, but you see that in like media depictions. And I'm curious if you know anything about like why, is there a significance to that locale? You know, or if that is there's something interesting to be said about why that's a place that we don't see in other subcultures that have more facial tattoos. We don't see that the way that we might in certain street gangs.
I mean, I think it's about secrecy.
Yeah.
And the importance of keeping vows of silence, but also of protecting certain things from visibility and from like circulation. So a lot of, I mean, I didn't like stare at people's tattoos. You know, it's just bad, bad form. But also, you didn't touch them. I mean, to look at them was fine, but I mean, it still made me uncomfortable. But like to just be like reading someone's face, you know, while you're talking, especially their tongue. But there was a lot of script on tongues. There's a lot of script inside the lip, and you see this with like bourgeois. You see this with like trust fund kids that do a lot of traveling and they get like something in Sanskrit like on the inside of their lip. I see this with like the kind of like lumpen bourgeoisie, you know. But in this case, it's about the kind of importance of secrecy, and the secrecy was described as the tomb, like la tumba, and it means you like take it to the grave. But the body itself was also that grave. I mean, it was like where information goes to die, and it doesn't leave. And so to ask people questions about, you know, who are you? When did you join gangs? Like, what's this all about? That's not the conversation, you know, and there's no essence of it either. I mean, this is the other point that, like, if you go back through the sociology of gangs, it's really very focused on identity, and I'm trying to really undo that a bit. Yeah.
One question about, this is a technical thing. Do you know if what they were using, were they makeshifting their own electric tattoo machines, or were they doing hand poking?
In the beginning, there's a picture of this in the book. Did you see that one? It's like an early tattoo gun like the pandillas were like the gangs before the maras, like local gangs. And they had a ballpoint pen and the motor from an electric toothbrush and a needle and a paper clip, and if you just like plug it in, it's like this is going, and it's a needle, and they're just dipping it in like typewriter ink. And then if they messed up, they just take sandpaper. And, I mean, you know. But at the time that things really started, I think like connections between groups were tighter. So we're talking like 2003, 2004, and then as money from the illicit economy started to come in, tattoo guns became very common, like very exquisite ones, and then that allowed people who had a natural affinity for tattooing to like really do some work. So after like, you know, 2002, 2003, it shifted away from those primitive style tattoos, but you would also see people just needling away out of boredom. But no, like beyond that, was there something else that you said? There was another like mechanism that I think you mentioned.
The hand poking. I did the sandpaper thing once. I don't recommend it.
What is the hand poking one?
Like just exactly what you're saying. Like instead of using something that's like creating a vibration, you're literally just
taking
a pen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean that was again that was like doodling.
Yeah.
And I'm like I just can't deal with needles, you know. So that is very averse to it. I mean, they were just like, let me draw on you. I'm like, no, I can't. I mean, but they were very desensitized to that process. And that's, I think, you know, that kind of relationship to pain and to like being aware of the body, also to me, like really is structured in relation to thinking about the irrelevance or the kind of insignificance of the body in the face of like mano dura and these like styles of policing that are premised on not incarceration, but like annihilation of communities. Yeah.
In your incredibly well done afterward, you do make reference to 2018 protests against the fraudulent elections, and that it was a moment in which you had Mareros joining forces with the resistance. And I'm curious about whether, you know, whether there was any kind of more sustained engagement between those forces at all, or was it just during the protest? And what are the potential implications for the new government of Xiomara Castro, and what possibly can she do?
Yeah, in the afterword, I'm talking about the way that gang members show up in the barricades in the streets protesting fraudulent elections side by side with, you know, just people who consider themselves political activists. And I mean, they're also putting their lives on the line, so there's that. But it is continuous. I mean, I heard about that through a colleague, and she wrote about it. Emilia Frank Vitale is the author of this piece. But what I heard later as I traveled myself across the North Coast and talked to a lot of environmental activists who are opposing big extraction projects and like dam projects and you know, these like massive infrastructural disruptions of everyday life that come from corporate entities outside the country, is that when they've criminalized environmental activism at this point, so very similar to other places in the hemisphere, but they're sending environmental activists into the worst prisons in the country, which are now modeled on supermax prisons in the US with solitary confinement, et cetera. But they're sending them there as a kind of a threat. Like, it's the same threat that I think stands in the US. Is like the reason you don't want to go to prison is not because, oh, it's going to be so lonely in solitary confinement. It's like, no, you're going to like really suffer physically there and mentally, and you're going to be abused long term. I mean, there's a book by Peter Moskos, who's a criminologist, is really interesting, called In Defense of Flogging, where he's talking about like how anyone, like we got away from flogging precisely because it was so barbaric, but most people today would prefer to be flogged in public rather than to go and serve like a 5-year sentence in a maximum security prison. I mean, just like, yeah, I'd take the lashes in public any day, because you know you're coming out of 5 years in supermax just destroyed. You might as well just be in pain for a while. So that says a lot about the kind of achievements of modernity. But in Honduras, these prisons have put environmental activists and gang members side by side, like very high-ranking gang members, and they've just been talking in prison. So I met some environmental activists who were like, you know, these MS-13 guys, like, really, I mean, they really can talk politics. I'm like, I mean, yeah, you don't get a chance to talk to them very much, right? But if you're in like 2 cells at a kind of a like very isolated and abandoned wing of one of these new, harsh prisons that have been built in the country, to get away from the prisons I'm describing in the book, which are like co-governed and very different. Then you're going to talk a lot, and they realize like that it's not about sort of like what people associate as like gang culture versus like environmentalism, which would be in the kind of popular imagination very different. It's about criminalization and the ability to live a daily life without violent disruption from a state that's trying to like extract from you everything that it can biopolitically. So that, yeah, I mean, that's a very tough domain. I heard it and I was like, that sounds like a great project for someone else.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
But do you have any speculation on what Castro can do?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm kind of baffled still, but you know, I'd hate to. I don't want to really speculate, but I think it's going to be very difficult to reverse the kind of relationships that gangs have with cartels, because that's just. I mean, you would have to. That's not going to work out well for you.
Right, and the cartels presumably will penetrate our government to some degree.
Well, they could just have their way with gangs, the way that they have their way with everything else in the country. So, I mean, I don't think that it's the DEA's. I'm just purely talking off the cuff here, but I mean, I don't think that it's the DEA's objective in Honduras to like bring it to a state where everybody feels like moving forward is going to be kind of, you know, there's a new horizon. I think that Juan Orlando Hernandez had become a liability and was embarrassing, and to have him visiting DC, this is a president who's under extradition. To have him visiting DC is just like, it's too much political capital lost for the U.S. It's too naked. So the Nationalist Party, who normally rigs elections, sat one out, so they wouldn't have to be in charge when his extradition actually takes place, and Xiomara Castro is running the country for the moment. I mean, I would like to think that this is a kind of populist wave, but I mean, the rigging of the past few elections was so brazen and thorough, and also so easily like assimilated to history that it's hard to believe that like, oh, suddenly like the Liberal Party's back in office. Like the system works.
Well, but it helps when all the U.S. media, you know, hey, there were elections, there were people, this goes up.
Yeah, I mean, it shows like that when they were saying that these elections weren't fraudulent, perhaps they weren't, because look, we just, you know, the Liberal Party's back in office. I mean, I think there's a lot of calculation there. It's a very difficult situation to fix, as you know, and there was I mean, it was just clear that as the sons of former presidents were indicted and convicted in courts in the U.S. and mainly in the Southern District of New York for narco trafficking, that this went all the way up into the ruling families, and then people started turning on Juan Orlando himself, that something had to be done. So I don't, you know, I wonder what Xiomara Castro thinks is even possible, because the way that Mel Zelaya, her husband, who was subject of a coup in 2009. I mean, he did a lot of amazing things preceding like actually messing with hegemony. I mean, like when he went after like Texaco and started thinking about getting oil from Venezuela, that's when it broke. It wasn't about raising minimum wage. Or, I mean, you know, those things can kind of, the misery of the present can sort of move into the future very easily with those like band-aids on reality, but like structural change. So, you know, that's when the U.S. Embassy, I don't know, pulls out. Mhm.
So we've hit the 2-hour mark, so I think maybe we'll give our fabulous guest speaker a chance to catch his breath for a
Thank you so
second.
much for coming.
I gotta
And then,
run, man, but great seeing you again.
It's great to
Continue with the
I'll send
seminar,
you an
so
email.
thank you very much.
I mean, we have